Are we ready?
We're ready. Can everybody hear Sherman?
Can everybody hear me?
Okay.
All right, I'm pretty loud anyways.
All right. So I'm going to let you give us a little bit of your background, and Sherman's been here. What I like about Sherman is he's not afraid to bring up issues, ask great questions. So now we get a chance to ask him some great questions, so that he can enlighten us on when and how to use Agile. Go ahead, take
Thank you, thank you. So you'll notice that the opening slide says that the goal should be to get better, not to get agile. One of the things I've noticed is if I go into a company and they say, we're agile, we're going agile, one of the first things I ask them is, well, how as part of that are you integrating continuous improvement? And if they can't answer that question for me, then there's a fundamental root cause, there's a fundamental problem there. They're not understanding the journey that they're supposed to be on. So, as a electrical engineer, nuclear engineer, and software engineer, I have my PMP, I have my CSM, I have my MBA, and I'm TOGAF certified, which means I have 4 different ways to screw up projects. Okay? And all these methodologies have their pros and cons. And as practitioners, we have to be balanced and seasoned enough to know how to see the realities and not get ideological about a particular practice. And you'll notice that the name of the discussion is not Agile sucks or don't ever use Agile. It's when does Agile hurt? When can you actually cause yourself more harm than good by either drinking too much of the Kool-Aid or not knowing when to balance it and when to integrate other things. So I just thought I'd share with you some of the lessons I've learned about the pros and cons of Agile, when it really will do great things for you, and when you need to start being a little bit more cautious.
You have a little clicker. You have a laser right there. Okay. A little clicker forward and back.
All right, let's try that. Okay. So this should not be, this is kind of a classic, right? And any of you who are at my 2010 speech, some of these slides may look familiar if you were here 6 years ago. By the way, I thought it was really cool to find out that I got us kicked out of the hotel. And I don't know if that makes me like an 80s rock band or something, but I thought that was kind of cool. And I'm really hoping I'm not gonna get us kicked out of Chompies. But at any rate, this is pretty classic. What are the grim facts about software development? So a small percentage of projects are actually considered to be completely successful. Now this again is a little bit antiquated, but the numbers aren't that much better in this day and age. They're a bit better, and actually a lot of the reasons why they're a bit better is because some folks have been using Agile methodologies correctly in the right circumstances. But you can see that software is a pretty difficult thing to accomplish. Very low, less than 1 in 5 software projects are on time and on budget. Projects that are actually considered flat-out failures, 1 in 3. And this really spoke to me. What are the reasons when they did root cause analysis, the Standish group, for these sort of issues? Lack of user involvement. The one that I'm going to really be harping on today is no clear statement of requirements. I think that really is the root of the root, and no project ownership. And by the way, one of the things I'm going to challenge is whether or not Agile is actually a classic project management methodology. Because when you actually, what is a project? In classic PMBOK? Well, I would maintain, per the PMBOK, a project is a temporary endeavor. There's a defined beginning and a defined end. Well, actually, one of the most common Agile practices is called Scrum. Who here has worked in a Scrum environment? We've got half-ish, maybe a little bit less than that. So really, I would maintain, and I actually wrote this slide in 2010 before some of the new buzzwords like DevOps came around. We can talk what that means. By the way, I really want to be highly collaborative. I am not religious about any methodology, so if you have something you want to jump in and talk about and say, well, I'm not sure I agree with that, what exactly do you mean by this? This is a collaboration. So what I would maintain is that Scrum is actually not a classic project methodology. The piece that fits that definition is right in here with what they call a sprint, okay? Does any of this look familiar? Have any of you guys seen the Scrum tool aid with this pretty picture? So in effect, the theory is, and I'm trying to make sure, I'm actually recording this for Tom, so I'm bouncing back and forth, but you'll see there in the corner the stakeholders. So one of the best practices in Scrum is you have this person called a product owner. So that's one of the first things, if you'll remember from the previous slide, no project ownership. So one of the first things that they tried to fix is we need to have that one throat to choke. We can't have people running down the hall and telling the developers, well, you thought you were doing this, but I really want you to do this other thing. And I've absolutely seen that in corporate America. So one of the first things is, here's the throat to choke. This is the person who ultimately makes the decisions on what's going to actually come out of the development pipeline the next month. So he basically holds the stakeholders at bay, negotiates with them, and prioritizes what they call the product backlog, right? So the negotiations are outside the development team. Then, when it's time to decide what's actually going to be executed on for the next month, those particular requirements end up in a queue that is basically then detailed out. So one of the other techniques is you don't actually do all your full requirements up front. You basically kind of sketch out, some people call them, stories, but you're only doing the title, you're not doing any details. But once they end up in the hopper for the sprint, then all of a sudden the developers and the subject matter experts from the business get together and they have this group hug, right? It's their friends, their buddies. Boy, it's great to work with you again on this new thing we're going to get into production the next month. And they have this wonderful ability to have a conversation. I've seen that happen in the 20-ish years that I've been using Agile methodologies, and I've actually gone all the way to what they call extreme programming. So I've literally been pair programming to put streaming video. If you guys remember the Sydney Olympics, I worked for a startup that got the rights to bring the streaming video into the States back at the time when we only had DSL. And we were literally pair programming right at the last minute to get everything running, or as optimal as possible. I've only seen a situation where the developers could sit there and rub shoulders with the stakeholders and really have a deep collaboration once in 20 years. Now you can have good relationships, but like any sort of relationship, you need to work on it, you need to build it. And generally speaking, what I've found out is when we talk about doing the first tweak that I've seen be effective with Scrum is actually adding someone who really knows how to do true requirements. Even if we're calling them user stories, even if what we're doing is acceptance criterion, having someone who can really help your normal developer build that relationship, if they're good, a business analyst has worked their weight in gold as far as I'm concerned. And they're very rare. But anyway, so now all of a sudden everything hops in, you're detailing out the requirements, the engineers get together and start knocking out, well, here's what I'm going to have to do to make this thing happen. In theory, you've got this team, they have all the skills they need right there, so there's not going over to a different department to talk to the database guy, or doing this or doing that. It's all right there within that team, right? And then 30 days, so every day they get together, they talk, they figure out, how they can help each other. They talk to the BA about, can you go ask the business how this or that or the other thing really is supposed to work? And then magic happens 30 days later, and a working increment of code comes out that theoretically is deliverable, something that can be thrown up into, on the website or whatever your product is. This is a lot of work. This just doesn't happen overnight, right? So hopefully you can see what I mean by this is not a classic, PMI sort of thing. This is long-term, right? This is building a team to make a long-term investment in a product that your company's going to sell, where you want that team to be able to move as nimbly as possible as your market changes. This is not a temporary endeavor. Any questions? All right, so what is Agile's sweet spot? When it's fundamentally recognized that software development is ideally managed using empirical process models, right? Well, that's a little bit different right there. And a lot of people miss this. The people that came up with Agile, Ken Schwaber, I believe, was one of the key people. He actually went to DuPont and spent a lot of time talking to people that had their PhDs in process methodologies. People that could teach us a lot about what the PMBOK really is all about. And they looked at the traditional software development models that Ken was having difficulty making work. And apparently they just burst out laughing and said, you're fundamentally doing this wrong. You're dealing with a very complex, problem with a lot of complex personalities. You're going to have a very adaptive sort of methodology. So that's one of the things that was the light bulb for starting Scrum, is the fact that this is all about continuous improvement. Small co-located teams, so again, that speaks to the fact that when you have a smaller team, they're going to learn how to work together better over time if you give them the time to do that. Again, software is a complex machine. It really is. Is there anybody here who actually has been a developer? We've got a couple, right? This is not easy stuff, is it? When you really get into it. You've got all sorts of potential inputs, outputs, behaviors that can happen if you're not very rigorous about your design. It's a complex machine, and it takes some pretty decently skilled knowledge workers. Now, maybe I shouldn't have said highly skilled, because I actually think you can take a decent developer and wrap the right sort of support structure around them and take them up a notch. And I love seeing that. I've had that opportunity on a few occasions. I would maintain that the whole key and goal to Scrum is to actually drive a team towards continuous improvement. Again, if you're not seeing those sorts of conversations going on, then something's wrong. Again, it's critical that because you're not actually doing all the requirements up front, and again, that's fundamentally not like a classic PMI thing, right? Classic PMI is, what are my true requirements? I'm building this building, and this is something that a lot of people have done before. We all know how to build buildings. We know how to run our structural analysis on the soils and the concrete and right? So it's a pretty well-known domain. So you can get your requirements, get that project plan together, figure out what your dependencies are, and start moving forward. But here, we're chasing markets. We don't know what the market may bear a month from now as far as what people will pay for an online service. So at the last minute, being able to say, now, Mr. Stakeholder, what do you really mean? Is actually quite important and quite valuable. It's not a downside to Agile. It's actually a good thing when done properly in the right environment. And also welcome changing requirements. So again, literally, if you have the right relationship, being able to have the person come down the halls and say, I know this is what I told you, and I even think that's what I meant, but now that I see it, it's not quite right. We're all learning, so here's how I'd like it modified. And everybody goes, cool, this is not a problem, this is an opportunity. Okay, how many times have you seen that in a software shop? So if you're not seeing that, then that means that there's something not ideal within the environment that you're trying to implement Agile methodologies in. Okay? Are requirements really that hard? So again, I said that I think the root of the root cause is requirements issues. Now, I know this is a stretch comparing requirements to pornography, but if you think about it, here's a brilliant man who was on the Supreme Court, who was asked to create rulings on what pornography is, what is obscene material, and he couldn't, and yet he ultimately said, well, I know it when I see it, right? So it's I'm not seeing much amusement over the analogy between obscene materials and requirements, but requirements are extremely hard. They really are. And a lot of times the reality is, until you see something actually, working in front of you, how the buttons work, how the images are rendered, the behavior between screen to screen, you're just going to have a great deal of difficulty articulating it until you actually see it. So part of Agile is recognizing that working code and then getting that feedback is pretty important, including the opportunity of saying it's not quite right, but it's not the developer's fault. It's a joint effort. Okay. Agile in its pure form was not designed to address PMBOK knowledge areas. This is my opinion. But as an example, if you're trying to do, how many people have been in a corporate environment? And and the management team on one hand says, well, here, I hear that Agile is like a great way of getting stuff done. We really need to do this big ERP implementation, and I want you to use Agile techniques but I want you to tell me now how much you're going to spend over the next 18 months to get this thing implemented, right? That's, okay, that is like one of the hardest things that I've seen time and time again when it comes to Agile methodologies. Now, there are some techniques to try and manage that, but at the end of the day, it represents the fact that there is this fundamental friction between the way a lot of management teams want to view their investments and their risks and their portfolios versus what a lot of developers can really do well using Agile methodologies, okay? So again, time management and cost management is usually quite a different thing in classic PMI parlance. So if you're in that sort of dichotomy where you have a management team saying, you know, you're only allowed to spend 1.1 million and here's your team, and you have to get it done in 18 months, right? But go ahead, you should be successful if you're using Agile. You've got some challenges there. That's just a painful reality. Has anybody dealt with that before? Yeah, I'm seeing a few like flinches of pain and agony there. Scope management. So again, triple constraints, right? So if you have someone throwing down time, cost, and scope, you've got your classic triple constraints. And at that point, I would strongly consider that while you might use some Agile best practices to manage the team on a daily basis, you fundamentally should also be managing the overall risk and complexity and interdependencies of the project using classic PMI structures, your Gantt charts, your critical path, right? So if someone says to you, and I've seen this before, and it's stunning, right? Here's your triple constraints. I expect it done in this time period with these people, with this amount of money. Use Agile because that should help you. And what the hell is that Gantt chart? You have some tough conversations ahead of you with your management team. Okay? And again, I throw out human resource management because a lot of times what I'll see is, well, gosh, since you're using Agile, and this is a critical person, and they need to be involved in all these different portions of the project, they'll get thrown onto all these new Scrum teams and implicitly be thought of as someone who's 100% dedicated to those teams. So again, one of the classic things that the PMI manages is how dedicated is this person to this portion of the project, and being able to model that out. You will lose that if all of a sudden you throw that person into a bunch of Scrum teams and say, well, but they're only helping out a third of the time over here and half the time over here and 10% of the time over there. It never works that way. As soon as someone touches a Scrum team, they're going to get sucked in. And now they're overwhelmed, they're going to get burned out. Okay? So when will Agile really hurt you? If you're not very careful about having some balance and bringing in some of your seasoned knowledge from the classic, PMBOK, okay? If you're dealing with fixed budget, fixed time, fixed scope, you really need something to help you above and beyond classic Agile. Now another one I've seen, which is interesting, is where the business will say, look, it has to have this much functionality in it, and we really need to be off the old platform and on the new platform by such and such a date, but I'm going to start cutting big checks for you. And then all of a sudden the development teams and the development managers say, well, maybe that's okay, maybe we can pull this off, right? And what they usually forget, and this kills me, is the fact that you can't just have the school bus come rolling up, you can't call your favorite outsourced firm and say, give me some bodies, have the school buses come rolling up, and say, well, gosh, we think to get all this work done, it's going to take 10 Scrum teams, so we need 50 bodies, and then all of a sudden have them, just start being, highly performing, right? Now, when you call that third-party consulting firm up and pitch that at them, do you think they're going to tell you what the reality is, or do you think they're going to show up at the school bus, right? They're going to show up at the school bus, and now you've got a lot of stuff to manage. How are you going to manage that? My best guess is you're going to use classic PMI practices. It's your best mitigation strategy. You still have a lot of risk to manage, though, in that circumstance. What if you have a lot of globally dispersed teams? So again, we've all in this day and age been in a situation where we've got some folks in India and Russia, and they're all supposed to snap together and start working. And a lot of times there's interdependencies, right? Agile was not initially designed to handle that. In fact, I remember when the things went from XP as the most popular Agile methodology to Scrum, and a lot of the Scrum leaders at that point were saying, no, you need to keep it here, you need to keep the team small, you need to figure out, even if you have to scale to 2 or 3 teams, that they're co-located in a building. So the people who came up with Agile for quite a while fought this whole globally diverse outsourcing, and at some point they realized they had to evolve or die, and they had to figure out how to make Agile scale globally. It can be done, it's difficult. Anybody, again, who says, here's your school bus here in the US, here's your school bus here in India, now you've got your 50 or 75 bodies, why aren't you being more productive? You know you have a challenge to deal with. And you're going to have long conversations about what tools you're going to need, what techniques you're going to need, and how long it's going to realistically take you to ramp into having a reasonable level of productivity across these globally diverse teams. Again, I've seen where a situation where you're coming into an organization, they say, here's this new thing that we want to drop in, this new ERP. It's got to work with all these other systems in your environment, and go, right? And so this is an example where a lot of times I use the term enterprise. What I practice right now is enterprise architecture. So a lot of times what I do is come into an organization and I try and lay out a vision for how they're going to effectively create the least number of data pipes and data flows, moving from system to system that will give them value, and then how are they going to manage those data pipes and get a lot of value. But that's some upfront work. I have to do some upfront design work. And when I have an organization that says, well, why aren't you coding? How come you didn't produce code in the last 2 weeks? Well, wait a minute, we just got into this thing. You've got 5 different systems that have inputs and outputs into your ERP, right? Shouldn't I, let me step back, measure twice, cut once. Well, you should be going. Well, there are techniques to get teams ramped up because, again, you want to start getting teams working together, practicing together, getting dirty together on developing code. But you should be very cautious for the first several sprints on whether that's actually production code or not. How do you want them to start working together? How do you want them to start building stuff? How are you getting them comfortable with the tools? There's a lot of there's reasonable ramp up there that you can still be productive, doing some architectural visions before you actually have the team start cranking code. And you're going to be better off for it. It's just a reality, whether people like it or not in the Agile world. Okay? This is a problem. Again, a lot of requirements are hard. So the general tendency is for the business to say, here's this huge document, boom, just go, right? And a lot of times that document has so many weird inputs and outputs and touch points, and well, you interpreted it in one way on page 15, but if you were to read page 52, that's what you should have read, and that's why what you built was wrong. So classically, requirements over the wall to the developers in such a way that the business is never wrong and the developer's always wrong. So I've seen where a lot of people still think that Agile means we don't have to do requirements. If you run into that, where people say, well, here's your story, why aren't you just coding? There's a problem. So how can you break Agile? So I threw this in because what I've seen is situations where people start doing Agile, they think maybe they're doing the right thing, they're into it, they're using the term sprints, right? They're going, right? And then all of a sudden, it just implodes. And they're like, well, what happened? I thought we were doing sprints, the developers felt pretty good about it. Well, what went wrong? Why did they not have the fundamentals in place before they actually started growing and going? It's because a lot of times, and this is one of the biggest problems I've seen, they think that they can do Agile project management or methodology without giving the engineers the right tools and tooling. At the end of the day, if you're trying to get to the point where you're doing lean requirements, where you're really saying what's the essence of what this data pipe has to do, what's the essence of what this website needs to do, And, and everybody feels good about that. Well, one of the reasons you can pull that off is if you have the right engineering discipline and tooling in place, so that once you do that minimal step forward in whatever the site's supposed to do, and the business comes down the hall and says, that was awesome, here's what I needed to do next, the engineers know how to quickly go in, run certain sort of tests and go, okay, I know exactly where, I haven't looked at this thing in 6 months, right? I know exactly where to go in to continue my journey, improving this web page or this function or this capability. So if you're in an organization and they're using Agile methodologies and they're not complementing that with the right sort of engineering tools, you're in for a long-term problem. And I've seen that time and time again, where I've come in as an architect, there's a Scrum team and they're outsourced. And they're like, we're gonna build this thing, here's my engineering design. And I look at it and I go, yeah, but if you build it that way, you're losing data. So you're losing customer data. Oh, well, we can't do that. Well, let's go back and look at the architecture. Let's go look up 3 data pipes in the flow through the systems. Well, if you were to add one extra little data element right there and ripple it down, and everybody goes, oh my God, don't do that. It took us 6 months to get that pipe stable, and nobody wants to touch it again. And so we're going to do something down here to just kind of get by and hope we don't break anything downstream. The fact is they did not set the right sort of, they didn't have the right requirements probably, they didn't do the right sort of testing, right, wrapping the right sort of testing, and now everybody's terrified of touching it. And now you've blown out your whole purpose for doing Agile. This team cannot learn how to progress quicker because they don't have the right tools. So again, unit testing I have found to be invaluable, but this is where real Agile is extremely hard. You've got to hire the right sort of talent. You can't just hire, you can actually hire people that are okay developers, but you need to give them an environment and the tooling so that they can learn and grow and learn how to do unit testing. How to know that when they build something that's actually going to create value in front of the customer, they've got this other thing that automates, an understanding of what that's supposed to do. So they can go over here and say, okay, that helps me understand this code base, and now I'm going to make a modification, and oh, it broke. And they can go in and understand how to fix it. So if you're in the software business and you're not putting the right tooling in place, you're going to have problems. And that's when all of a sudden people start over-engineering, right? Because they're anticipating anything the business might want to do in the next couple of years. And that's disastrous. That never works out. It is important to make sure that this team that you're building, and hopefully I went through the whole classic, another big root cause problem I've seen, and I think I've implied this, but now I'm going to just be very explicit. If you're not giving your engineering teams the opportunity to go through forming, storming, norming, and performing, you have a problem, right? If you can't convince leadership within your organization to give your team a couple sprints to get dirty and find out what works and what doesn't, and where each other's strengths and weaknesses are, you've got a problem. If you don't end up in a place when, at the point in time you're doing real production code, you see behaviors on the team where this guy comes walking over to this gal and says, I need your eyes on this. I'm struggling with how to design this, right? And then watch them rub shoulders and knock through the problem. If you don't see that sort of collaboration because they're afraid of admitting they don't know how to do something, you have a problem. You're not doing Agile. You're not. You're just flat out not. What if the product owner isn't protecting the team from everybody running down the hall and saying, look, I know this is what you guys were supposed to build. I also want you to throw this thing in. Well, developers, generally speaking, are not negotiators. That's something I actually forgot to articulate here. Developers will have a hard time saying, no, I really can't do that for you. You're going to have to go back to the product owner. They're going to find a way of saying, and justifying to themselves, well, maybe I can make this little change, maybe I can jack it in, and all of a sudden things become unstable because they're throwing too much work in, and ultimately that affects quality. Okay? So again, what if you've got a management team that's trying to drive towards Agile, but what if they're not having the conversation where they say, look, we really need this, we didn't see this coming, but we're willing to take this other thing off your plate. So, so what happens is a lot of times I see people use the term ask. So all of a sudden, scope changes, and instead of calling it real scope change, so this is where if you were a classic PMI, right, you would have a change control board, right? This is the new change. It's not a bad thing. Stuff happens, right? But we're going to be rigorous about understanding the change, understanding the impact to the team, right, and making some rational decisions. But if all of a sudden you just have these groups just running forward every 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever your sprint cadence is, and all of a sudden you get this insidious sort of, well, it's an ask. It's not really a scope change. It's just an ask. Can you just throw this in, right? Not a problem, right? Easy peasy. And all of a sudden you destabilize the code base. Okay? So again, ways of breaking Agile, abuse by the business, I've seen it, I guess I had to throw a Dilbert in somewhere, right? It's just classic. But here's where management is saying, well, I've heard these great things about Agile, so let's be Agile, right? And that should mean that now I can do more with less. It's just an automatic, it just happens, right? We're going to use these new techniques and buzzwords, and magic's going to occur. I don't have to buy tooling. I don't have to invest in the teams. I don't have to give them time to learn how to work together. And then, by the way, when you guys tell us that you can't get it done, I don't believe you. So I want you to give me a swag, right? When do you think this thing's going to get done? And then the team really honestly gets together. Now I want to be careful here, because the reality is, and the person who's cutting this multi-million-dollar check wants to have some level of understanding that if he's now investing, he or she is investing $2.1 million to get a new big system put in, and they're relying on that to help them do something important in the marketplace, they really legitimately want to have some sort of understanding. Now, if they've been really smart, they've already put teams together that know how to work together. They've already put the tooling together so the teams know how to use the tooling. And when they go to the team and they say, look, I really am willing to work with you on some bounds, this is the minimum on what I need out of the system. This is what I'd ideally like. Give me some decent numbers to work with here. And if they're truthful and they work with the engineering teams to truthfully understand that, then everybody's going to be okay. But it's a journey, and everybody has to work together. What I actually usually see is they get the high number, they get the low number. These are really to kind of understand what the minimum viable product is supposed to be, the MVP. And then instead, what management actually walks away with is, we're going to get everything we want, and it's for this lower number. And then they start pushing that message to the team. And again, the developers are not good negotiators. So they start saying, well, maybe we can pull that off, Meantime, maybe they're doing a little monster.com on the side because they know things are going to get worse and worse. Tell me it's not the truth. They're not going to go to management and say, cut my neck right now. I'll go home. I'll go bring a cardboard sign and say, we'll do DOS for food. Couldn't work at my old place. They're gonna justify it. They're not even being malicious about it. They're going to justify that on a day-to-day basis. They're going to do the best they can, but they know in their hearts they're on a train wreck, right? And they're going to do what they need to do to protect themselves and their family. So this is kind of a fun one. So anybody here who's used Agile, have you heard the term story points? What the hell is a story point? Right? So here you are, you're a PMI person, you've got your management people, right? And they want to know, how much is this thing going to cost me in dollars, right? Hard cash. And you've got teams running around saying, well, I think that's 3 story points. What the hell is a story point? How do I do anything with that? So here's the cool thing. I actually get story points. It took me years to get to the point where I really, really understood the value of a story point. And it's a conversation, and I actually have a Tom Brady analogy. And if you want me to, if we have time at the end, and you really want to understand how story points, and actually the best way I can describe the difference between Agile and classic PMI is whether or not you're in an environment that really, truly understands the value of story pointing and understands what it's going to do for them and what it's not going to do for them. So if you end up in a situation, and if we have this conversation and you feel you get the value of the story point, and you're in an environment and they say, well, we do story pointing, you're probably going to be able to ask them one or two questions based upon the analogy I give you. And if you get a weird, sense that this is not a meaningful, thing to them, and they don't get it, and they're not using it properly, you're probably in a situation where Agile is going to hurt that organization. Okay? We also have the potential for abuse by engineers. So engineers are interesting critters. Forgive me, because I know we've got an engineer right here. A lot of engineers are arrogant and insecure. Okay? Guy over there is now looking at me and saying, what the hell is that? What did you say? He's probably an engineer. I'm an engineer. Okay? I went through my journey of being arrogant and insecure. So he's still looking at me. You don't have a gun. Okay. So what do I mean by that? Doing engineering at a proficient level is very difficult. It's a work of art. Most engineers have this artistic flair to them, but it's extremely unnerving because every 18 months technology changes. So you get to the pinnacle of a certain technology and you're like, I got this, right? I'm at one point when I was helping Intel build their first database where they could see everything that had happened the night before across the world in all their fabs. So I built that. It was called GIMS. So at one point I was probably one of the world's leading experts on what's now called data warehousing. And I was the cat's meow, right? For about 12 months. And then all of a sudden things changed, technology changed, and I had to rebuild that skill set. So arrogant because you had to work your butt off to get to the point where you were one of the world's best in a particular environment, and then insecure because something that you were paid $200 an hour for 6 months ago, you may now only get $25 to $50 an hour for. That's freaking unnerving when you're an engineer, okay? So, you got a lot of strong personalities, and a lot of times you'll have someone come in and they're like, no, I'm the hero here. I'm the guy that's going to take this team and drive it. Big problem. You have problems on that team. Unless you fix that, fire this dude. I don't care how good he is. I don't care if he really is the rock star on your team. You fire him. You say, I am more interested in people that are willing to be team players that I'm going to invest in than you, who's going to come in and try and rescue the team every 3 weeks. Not good. And I've also seen this, where part of Agile is everybody is supposed to get their eyes, or at least a couple people are supposed to get their eyes on each portion of the code base. If that's not happening, if they're abusing it and ignoring that part of the rigorous, hard part of Agile, you're going to end up with problems. Okay? So what have we learned so far? Software is complex. It's best managed by empirical process modeling. So that's not me. I'd encourage you guys to look up software development empirical models and look at some of the thought that a lot of brilliant people have done. And they've boiled that into this thing called Agile. But it's difficult, it's hard, it's not a panacea, and it can be abused in bad ways. Okay? Ideally, a company will recognize that software development never really ends, right? And I've seen that too, and I had one engineer that was muttering one time, the company's given us enough money to birth this baby, and now they're done with it. And they're not thinking about how we're going to feed it, clothe it, mature it, right? Software is very rarely ever done, right? So it's a journey, it's an investment. You need to put together teams for the long term. Really, you want to keep teams as small as possible. If you can give them different areas of importance within an overall code base. You do need to invest in the right tooling and provide the time for the teams to get to work together. You have to, if necessary, if you've got a complex environment with the triple constraints, even if you're doing iterative development, right? If you've got your triple constraints, you need that higher level command and control, classic PMI sort of stuff. So they just need to realize that a lot of times hybrids are not a bad thing. If you find a group that's dealing with the triple constraints, and then there are people that are saying, but we're only going to do ideal pristine agile without any sort of modifications, they don't get it. That breaks the empirical whole value proposition. Okay? So is agile enough? So, so I'm maintaining that agile, Scrum is not enough in a complex environment. So is that just my opinion? Not necessarily. So some really smart people have gone off and don't start looking at this going, I'm going to try and understand this. But you may want to, write down the name SAFe. So one guy by the name of Dean Leffingwell actually started thinking through, well, how do I take the best of Agile, right? These values, what he now calls value streams, these continuous delivery mechanisms. And how do I get them working in an environment where they're working with the business in a holistic, effective way, with the enterprise architect, that's me, in an effective way, and how do I build this, right? So he's given a lot of thought to this, and I can actually give you folks the name of somebody locally that I have deep respect for, who has his PhD from ASU, and he has a consulting firm, and he helps companies sort this out, right? Now, is SAFe a panacea? Absolutely not. In fact, I'm a little leery of SAFe because they actually do story pointing in a way I find dysfunctional. Now, of course, that's my opinion. I could probably, work with different groups to get around that, some different experts. So on one hand, you've got people trying to harden Agile and add some classic, command and control structures around it, but even that's not perfect. Another one that's actually worth looking at is disciplined Agile delivery. So this is Scott Ambler. Is there anybody here who's familiar with RUP, the Rational Unified Process? Okay, so RUP became something else. So RUP actually became the Open Unified Process. Scott Ambler is the guy who actually did that. And then basically IBM just quit talking about RUP. And Scott went off, he left IBM, and he came up with his disciplined Agile delivery. So again, this is an example of someone who's trying to create a more hardened environment where you're getting a lot of the value out of these, talented teams that are delivering code, and you're wrapping the right sort of infrastructure around them. I might be done. I might be close. With about 10 minutes left.
No, you're good. You're doing fine.
Great, great.
Because we'll take some questions.
Okay. So again, software is hard. There's a lot of talented folks that are trying to figure out how to take that empirical sort of model and wrap it with the right sort of rigor. So you're liking this, aren't you? You should just come on over and hang out with us.
I just can see the board better.
Okay, all right. But if you just think that using a buzzword like Agile is going to get you where you want to go, and you're not recognizing that it's hard, you need the right sort of talent, you need the right sort of support. If you do it, man, I've literally, they talk about that developer that is 10 times more productive than this other developer. I've seen it, and it's not because that person was a rock star initially. It was because they were given the right sort of support structure and team environment. And that actually dovetails into why story pointing can be very powerful when done properly in the right environment. So again, the goal is to get better, it's not to get agile. It's about continuous improvement, especially in the software industry. So that's what I got. We have about 10 minutes left. I'd love to answer any questions you have. I'll be disappointed if you don't have questions. Challenge me. See if you can make me cry. Come on, someone. Or you're going to hear my Tom Brady analogy.
I was going to say
Tom Brady? Is that what we want?
Yeah.
Okay. So again, so we do have some people here that have used, should we just turn this off at this point? Should we turn the projector off?
Yeah.
Maybe. So some people here have heard the term story point, right? Okay. And so when would a story point be actually something meaningful? And so what I've seen a lot of times is people coming into a room with a new development team, right? And you've got this person who just, got religion in terms of Agile, they just got their CSM, and we're going to story point, right? So the team looks at a story, right? They may not even have enough requirement details, hopefully they do. They start thinking what their tasks are. They start thinking about how long it's going to take them to do this thing. And then the Scrum Master says, well, I don't care about your estimate, I want your story points. And the team goes, what's that? you know, or they know what it is, but it's like, but no, I need to tell you what this is going to take me. And the person says, no, I need a story point. Okay, it's maddening if you don't really understand what's going on. So here's my Tom Brady analogy. So Tom, and ironically, I swear to God, this analogy I came up with before the Super Bowl. So the Super Bowl actually only reinforced the story I'm going to tell you, right? So even before the last Super Bowl, Tom Brady was a pretty impressive quarterback. Fair statement, right? No one can really refute that, even if you're not a Patriots fan. Does anybody here know what his draft pick number was?
199.
Yeah. I heard 160, actually, 166. He was actually picked up, good man, he was actually picked up in the 6th round. That means that the Patriots and everybody else overlooked this guy for the first 5 rounds, right? How could that, so he was obviously okay, he managed to make the cut to get into the NFL, but nobody saw it coming. So what happened? How did this guy come in? And by the way, so he comes in, he sits on the bench for 2 years, right? I'm seeing some sports fans here going, yeah, I'm not a football guy, I gotta admit that. I'm a paleontologist, so when you guys are watching football, I go off and I go find dinosaurs, right? But I was talking to a buddy and I was telling him, you know, about team building, and he goes, you need to tell a story about Tom Brady. So this guy comes in, 6th round, sits on the bench for 2 years, Bledsoe gets hurt, he comes in, all of a sudden, you know, amazing things happen. Now, are there any other super athletes on the Patriots, generally speaking? So we hear about Tom Brady, okay? So isn't that an interesting point? And that gets into where I'm going with this. So Tom Brady was a leader. He went in, he built a team. He took some fairly talented individuals and he built a team. Now, imagine if you would, that you had a conversation with one of the running backs and before the Patriots went to this next level, right? You sat the guy down and you said, well, look, we're about to go play the Cowboys, right? How many yards are you going to contribute against the Cowboys based upon your past experience? Well, gosh, you know, generally speaking, the Cowboys are this sort of team. I played against them once. I should be able to contribute 12 yards. Okay, right? It's not an unfair question to ask, you know. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't tell you what that individual is going to be able to do in a team setting where that team's been able to go through forming, storming, norming, performing, right? So what happens is this person who in the past on a less than stellar team was only contributing 12 yards, when he's in an environment where he's getting the support he needs, with the leadership he needs, he's contributing twice that, maybe even 3 times that. And occasionally he busts through and he goes all the way, you know, for a touchdown and you know, racks up over 100 yards. But it was because of the team and the leadership. So what happens is the person who came up with story pointing, again, some brilliant minds that work with folks, you know, that have PhDs at DuPont, they said what we want you to try doing is breaking the paradigm of going into a new team and then saying, but here's how I used to do it in the past. Here's what I think my contribution can be. Well, when you have that first set of conversations with people about saying, what are you going to be able to contribute on this team? It's difficult. So someone came up with this artificial, it's flat out artificial, right? And so that's what a story point is. So you need to kind of tell the team, if you're playing the story point game, that this is artificial. It's going to feel uncomfortable, but at the end of the day, we're going to start with an artificial number, right? So when we saying maybe we're going to t-shirt size, there's actually different techniques for starting your initial baseline on a story point system for a team. So one of the other dysfunctions you're going to run into, and this is actually my big problem with SAFE, and I don't know what they were thinking, is story points and what that number ends up being is only valuable for that team. That's it, right? It doesn't matter if the story point is 25 or 75. It's only meaningful for that team because it's their internal way of saying, here as a team is how much work we think we can get done when we look at the sort of work that's coming down the stream, right? Does that make sense? So that's the reason for story pointing, is you want to try and break them from thinking about what they were able to do in the past and how much they were able to contribute in the past on different teams. Because this team has the potential to be a breakout team. Does that make sense?
Yep. We're getting close to the end of the hour. Any more questions? Do we have questions for Sherman at all? Yes, in the back.
I just wanted to understand the best practice, like how many iterations do you recommend within a release? Just to make sure that you don't have too many, I mean, you don't make the release too heavy and you don't, throw in less number of changes within a release. So is there any recommendation that the number of iterations should be having?
So I'm having
Number of migrations.
number of iterations.
Iterations.
Number of iterations to accomplish what?
Within a release, like when you plan any release, like you have multiple iterations, and each iterations might be 2 weeks. So do you recommend any number of iterations like it should be within a release, so that we basically launch, evolving basically release some software changes every 3 months, every 6 months?
So this is an example of where it really is going to depend on what evolves in your culture with your team based upon your code base. This is a classic example of where it is empirical. So you may start, at the end of the day, what's more important is when they're in that iteration, and by the way, I find 2 weeks to be pretty small, unless they're working with, wash, rinse, repeat sort of like building data pipes, something that's well known to them. Generally speaking, and this is where I adapt Scrum, right? I usually go for 3 weeks, and I do require, especially if it's a new team, that they spend the first 2 or 3 days doing object-oriented design for me, right? Which feels anti-agile. But what I have found is if I force them to do some design up front, OO design up front, when they punch that button to take their OO design and create their stub, objects, they are much more productive for the next 2.5 weeks. So that's an adaptation that I did. That was an empirical decision I made based upon some cultures. So on one hand, you want to get the team dirty with doing releases, even if it's imperfect. So what's more important to me is get them dirty, let them feel the pain, make sure you get the feedback on what worked and what didn't for this release, right? Make sure they understand the feedback on getting the bugs put into the queue and prioritized along with new features. But you also need to then tell management, this is the critical thing. If if you're telling management that you're going to get like quality production code, say 3 sprints out, if that's the number you pick, that's a bit dangerous. You want to get that first release and you want to manage, leadership's expectations and say, we're learning how to work as a team. It's going to be rough, but working code is important. So when you see this working code, be respectful. We're right now only at the storming phase. We've got 2 people that are fighting, and I'm trying to get both of them to learn to chill out, right? Give us positive feedback, give us honest feedback, and understand that it's going to get better and better. So what you want to look for is iteration 5 significantly better than iteration 3? That's the real question you want to ask yourself.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay, let's do a little bit of housekeeping.